Hi there, we're going over Chapter 15 today, the autonomic nervous system, and I'm going to pause here for a minute to say, hey, remember Chapter 13? We kind of went over it, sort of not, and the reason why I was light on Chapter 13 is because I usually fold some of those elements into the autonomic nervous system. So we've talked about the spinal column, the bones, right? Remember we talked about, breakfast at 7, lunch at 12, dinner at 5, and so forth. Those elements are going to come back to visit us again here in this particular lecture when we start talking about the nerves that run out of the spinal cord into what we're going to call the periphery or the rest of the body. So we have the central nervous system that is broken up into several different elements, but usually, we just say the brain and the spinal cord. Coming out of part of the brain and definitely the spinal cord are long nerves, which consist of many axons going out to contact what we call a target. The target is the thing that the brain is talking to, saying, do something. So a lot of times when we were talking about our lecture, when we talked about just simple nervous system, what we were talking about was part of the world being sensed. Okay, so that was sensations. That is information coming in. So we have, let's say, I'm just going to draw a circle here for the brain. We have stuff going out, which is efferent, and we have stuff coming in. Now, the stuff coming, which is afferent, right? So the stuff coming in all has to come from peripheral receptors. Okay, so I don't know why. There we go. So let's pretend that this is a peripheral receptor sending information to the spinal cord. All right, so this is afferent. This is information out, or efferent. The information out does go down the spinal cord, but it also escapes the spinal cord and contacts whatever the target is. And so part of what happens in afferent and efferent is the discrimination between central nervous system and somatic activity. Somatic activity definitely has afferent and efferent. Afferent would be, like feeling a hot burner and picking your hand up. That would be sensation. So afferent a lot of times is sensation. And then the efferent could be, let's say, a local reflex or you choosing to do something like picking your hand up to grab a pen to take notes. All right. So afferent information would be listening to a lecture, and efferent information would be the physical act of writing. All right, so there are other things, though, that we don't have control over. In that particular case, that is a somatic activity. Somatic meaning of, like soma, body, cells. So when you say somatic, that pretty much means that your brain is telling your skeletal muscle to do something. When we start talking about the autonomic nervous system, though, all right, this is where we start talking about things that we don't have control over. So it's either the sympathetic or parasympathetic. Sympathetic is going to be our fight or flight response. The fight or flight response is basically a stress response that happens in organisms, mammals, fish even do this. And that autonomic response, that fight or flight, is meant to get you through the stressful stimulation so that you can survive to see another day, right? Basically, if you're looking at this lion here, this female lion, so it turns out that the female lions do the hunting, right? Remember Hakuna Matata, Lion King? The female lionesses do the hunting. And so let's say you're walking around out in the middle of nowhere and all of a sudden you run into a lion. Well, that's going to trigger a fight or flight or autonomic response. And you're going to get the heck out of there so that you'll survive, so you don't become her next meal, right? And so autonomic responses are a big deal. They keep you alive. Now, an autonomic response can be triggered by exercise. Let's say you work out every day really hard. That can actually cause problems with your autonomic nervous system. Let's say you get sick, you catch the flu. that's going to trigger an autonomic response to help get you through that stressful period. So when we talk about stress, all right, remember that stress is something that threatens the body, and it could be something that is acute, like a lion coming after you, or chronic, like taking anatomy online. So let's talk about the divisions of the autonomic nervous system, all right? So the autonomic is also called the PNS, or the peripheral nervous system. Remember, we talked about the central, which is the brain and the spinal cord, and the peripheral nervous system is going to consist of all the nerves coming out of the brain itself, the cranial nerves, also the nerves emanating out of the spinal cord, and elements bringing information in through sensory structures. So the autonomic peripheral nervous system is responsible for certain muscles. In this case, it's going to be smooth muscle and cardiac muscle, all right, and glands. Sympathetic and parasympathetic divisions are going to be ruling kind of back and forth what's happening in your body. We'll get to that in a minute. So let's first review very quickly our afferent division here, okay? Afferent is, again, information in. Info in. And so we have our special sense receptors like our vision, balance, smell, taste. We have somatic receptors. These are going to be things in the skin surface like our pressure receptors, thermoreceptors. It's also information coming out of skeletal muscles, joints, nociceptor, pain. Okay, nociception is the sensation of pain. And body position information. We also have visceral receptors. Now, visceral always has to do with monitoring of internal organs. These are going to be things linked to the cardiovascular system, digestive system, reproductive, urinary, respiratory systems. So the viscera are basically everything inside of your thoracic, abdominal, and pelvic cavities, all of those organs, and they're all housed in there to be protected and also to regulate simply and quickly from the nervous system. All right, so information comes in, all right, afferent information comes in from all these receptors. It's processed in the brain, and then there are what we call motor commands going out. This is our efferent division, okay, so this is info out. Now, this splits into the somatic nervous system, which is skeletal muscle, which we talked about quite a bit in another lecture, but now we're going to talk about autonomic, parasympathetic, and sympathetic. Sympathetic is fight and flight, fight or flight, and the parasympathetic is rest and digest, R&D, okay? Both of these control smooth muscle, cardiac muscle, and glands. And when fight or flight is turned on, rest and digest is off. When rest and digest is on, fight or flight is turned off. So we have antagonistic activation of smooth muscle, cardiac muscle, and glands, which we call effectors, okay? And this antagonistic activation is what lets our body say, hey, we're about to be eaten by the lion, or, we just had Thanksgiving. It's time to digest, relax, and absorb all the nutrients so that we can be ready to fight or flight if we need to. So here's just autonomic nervous system regulates smooth muscle, cardiac muscle, glands. This is all done without conscious control. All right, now, sometimes students ask me, but wait a minute, what if I have a bad dream and I wake up and my heart is pounding and so forth? Your dreams, you don't necessarily have control over that. What if I have stress? What if I have anxiety? Again, that's another thing that, you might be able to talk yourself down a little bit, but we're really talking about here like digestion, the diameter of your blood vessels, your blood pressure, right? These are things that you don't think about. It's your cardiac rate. Yeah, maybe you might be able to freak yourself out and make your heart pound a little bit faster. Or you might be able to meditate and cause your smoother cardiac muscle to slow down. But that's different from that motor activation of skeletal muscle. So basically, for the most part, if we go back one slide here, our sensory information, our afferent division, this is voluntary. And our autonomic or peripheral is involuntary. It's really hard to control cardiac and smooth muscle and glands. So What is the autonomic nervous system composed of? Same old thing as the central and then the peripheral. Nerves, glia, nerves and glia, neurons, ganglia are going to be are clusters of neurons associated with nerves. And then we have these things called plexi. I'll show you what that looks like in a little bit. And then we also have our visceral effectors. Remember, effectors are the things that change. They do something. It's the tissues that are being acted upon. So let's go back again one slide. The effectors are going to be in the somatic nervous system, skeletal muscle. In the autonomic, smooth muscle, cardiac muscle, and glands. The receptors are all over here, info in, right? So let's talk about the two subdivisions of the autonomic nervous system. Sympathetic, fight or flight response. Get the heck out of here, we're about to be eaten. Increases your heart rate, causes pupils to dilate. Why do your pupils dilate? So you can take more information in from the environment around you. Definitely decreases GI movement. When you are running away from the hungry lioness, you're not digesting your food. Blood is leaving your digestive tract and actually being shunted to your legs and your arms, things that can get you out of that sticky situation. Sympathetic nervous system is usually active in times of stress, biological stress. Not just, oh my God, I had to get up so early. I mean, that's a drag. I'll give you that, all right? I have teenage kids in high school. I get up early. And it is a little stressful, I'll give you that. But when we're talking stress here, we're talking things that biologically are dangerous to you and your survival. So that's sympathetic, fight or flight. Parasympathetic is rest and digest. That's the best way to think about it. Restores your normal gastrointestinal function. After you go through a sympathetic activation, parasympathetic activation takes over. So sympathetic is on, parasympathetic is off. Once you get away from the lion, sympathetic's turned off and parasympathetic turns on. So it restores your GI function. Usually people have to go to the bathroom after that. Urination happens. Reproduction can happen during it becomes more prioritized during parasympathetic. Heart rate decreases. Pupils will constrict and adjust to light levels normally. The increase in GI motility is a big deal because after you've run away from the hungry lion, right, and you've deprived your body of nutrients, your body wants to get those nutrients back to get ready for the next time a lion's chasing you. And then parasympathetic is usually active, again, during resting and digesting conditions. Okay. This is the slide that I kind of struggled with when I was working on chapter 13. So it is my background is in neuroscience. And for me, I look at the brain and I look at the different nuclei in the brain and I look at how the brain is talking to the body and how the body talks to the brain to keep us alive. And it's very difficult for me to separate the two. That's just my habit. So like I said, I went kind of light on chapter 13 for you guys, but now we're going to pay attention to how the brain is talking to the periphery or all the targets in the body, all right? So the autonomic nervous system, again, sympathetic versus parasympathetic. We're going to call these sympathetic and parasympathetic divisions the thoracolumbar division or the cranial sacral division. What does this mean? Thoracic and lumbar. So here are thoracic and lumbar nerves. Sympathetic activation happens from T1 to T12. Remember, we had cranial, breakfast at 7. Thoracic, lunch at 12. Lumbar, dinner at 5. And then sacral is just sacral, up, right? So right now we're just focusing on thoracic and lumbar, thoracolumbar, okay, division. Each one of these areas here, T1 through T12, L1 and 2, it kind of ends at L2. Down here, don't worry about L3, 4, and 5 right now. We'll get to that in a minute, all right? What's going on here is we have things called preganglionic neurons. What's happening in preganglionic neurons, I'm going to try to draw a picture of the spinal cord, all right? This is the spinal cord. Remember, this is not the bone around the spinal cord. This is all white matter, and this is all gray matter. Remember, the gray matter is are made up of neurons. White matter are axons. In this particular area, you're going to find these things called lateral gray horns, all right? Lateral horns. So when I was in school, they called this dorsal horn, this is ventral horn. Now we call them the lateral gray horns. What it basically means is that we have neurons here that are sending information out. And so when you look at this part of the spinal cord here, what you're looking at is here, this is dorsal, this is ventral. This is dorsal, right, or posterior, and then anterior would be the opposite side here. So you are looking at the posterior or dorsal surface of the spinal cord in this artist rendition of the spinal cord. The primary preganglionic fibers are going to synapse or talk to other neurons, all right? We'll get to that in a minute. They talk to other neurons in collections called ganglia, all right? So you have the preganglionic neurons in the lateral gray horns here between T1 and L2 that send preganglionic fibers or axons, we can do /axons, to ganglia near the spinal cord. So adjacent to the spinal cord are all these little bumps, and those are called spinal ganglia. And what these are, let me come over here. Let me see if I have a picture. Okay, here we go. So here's a nicer picture of the spinal cord. Here is a neuron in the gray matter extending out here to what's called a ganglia. This little ganglia may or may not have another neuron in here. If it does, it synapses on that neuron. This is called the preganglionic neuron, and this would be the postganglionic. This is going to become important in a minute, all right? Now, in the case of the adrenal medulla, you actually don't have this happening. You have actually the spinal cord talking straight to the adrenals, which makes sense because if you need to initiate a fight or flight response, which relies on epinephrine, which is also called adrenaline, you don't want a synapse in the way. You want direct activation. Here, you have to have cell 1 talking to cell 2, then talking to the adrenal medulla, and that takes time. A single neuron is fast. So we'll get back to that in just a minute, so hold on. These ganglia near the spinal cord receive information, and then they release acetylcholine, which is an excitatory neurotransmitter, to stimulate other organs. So you have these postganglionic neurons. I said that backwards. The preganglionic stimulate the postganglionic. Preganglionic stimulate with acetylcholine. The postganglionic stimulate with norepinephrine. I have a better picture of this in a few minutes, so just bear with me, okay? This is just for fight or flight. So fight or flight, you start with acetylcholine, you end with norepinephrine on whatever organ you're activating. All right, norepinephrine is noradrenaline. Now, I know I said this thing over here. This is different. This is separate, okay? This is just a neuron in the spinal cord, let's say over here at, I don't know, T8, talking to a preganglionic neuron, talking to a postganglionic neuron in one of these little bumps, okay? This is going to be acetylcholine expressed at this, and this is going to be norepinephrine. And the norepinephrine is made by this cell inside of each one of these little ganglia. Okay, we're going to go through the parasympathetic craniosacral division in a few minutes. Right now, we're just dealing with just this segment, all right? Okay, so to review, we have the preganglionic fibers, which are cell bodies in that lateral gray horn here, okay? This is going to be dorsal. This is ventral. That's a D, okay? Or you could also think of this as posterior, and this is anterior, all right? And the axons emanate out from what are called the ventral roots down here, okay? And then here are the ganglia right here. Now, ganglionic neurons that are close to the vertebra, those are the sympathetic chain ganglia. They are attached to the body wall. They're close to the head and the neck and the thoracic cavity. There are also these things called collateral ganglia. You'll find these in the abdominal pelvic cavity, all right? In the adrenal medulla, this is an exception. to the pre and post ganglionic rule here. This again is where you have a situation where you don't have a synapse between the neuron and the affecting organ, the gland, the adrenal medulla, right? This is a quick activation of the autonomic nervous system to get you out of that situation where you're about to be eaten by the lion. So now here's a better representation looking at the sympathetic chain ganglia, which run adjacent to, remember, they're attached to the back body wall. Here's a spinal nerve. The spinal nerves, you can't really, you can see it here. So you see a neuron starting here in the ventral horn. I call this dorsal and ventral because that's how I was taught, but a lot of books call this posterior and anterior horns. I call them dorsal and ventral, and I'll try to make sure that it turns out that way on the test. Neuron extends an axon out to the autonomic chain ganglia, where it synapses onto a sympathetic postganglionic fiber. Now remember, right here, this is acetylcholine. Over here, whatever the target is, this is norepinephrine. All right. Now, these are called short preganglionic fibers. All right. They're short because they just extend over to the sympathetic chain ganglia. There are other long ganglionic neurons. That would be the postganglionic. So here you have, in the case of the sympathetic chain ganglia, short preganglionics, long ganglionic, postganglionic, I should say postganglionic neurons. So this black one, that can go all the way down to, let's say, for example, the adrenals, go down to the urinary bladder maybe, right, to control the contractile rate of the smooth muscles surrounding the urinary bladder so that the individual doesn't need to urinate while they're running away from the hungry lion. So the ganglion to the effector is, this ganglion is going to send out its axon, or the neurons in the ganglion, to the effector. And again, it's mostly norepinephrine. So this, it would be norepinephrine secreted here. Here you have acetylcholine. I'm going to get rid of this little norepinephrine label here because it looks a little confusing. All right. Now, collateral ganglia are a little bit different. Collateral ganglia also receive information from the ventral horn here, or the anterior horn, okay? However, it synapses somewhere else, and the great example of that would be innervating a visceral organ or a gland, like the adrenals, okay? So the adrenals are actually thought to be evolutionarily a bunch of collateral ganglia, little collections of neurons out in the body that came together to make a gland. You'll hear more about that in physiology. So here we are, sympathetic division of the autonomic nervous system. You have preganglionic neurons, lateral gray horn, this would be the ventral horn, all synapsing on sympathetic chain ganglia, collateral ganglia, which are unpaired, or the adrenal medulla, okay? These are producing acetylcholine. That's an H, sorry. And then you have innervation of each one of these into targets. And usually, with the exception of the adrenal medulla, because that's secreting into the bloodstream, this is norepinephrine. This is what I really wanted to show you. So we have a situation here. Here's the spinal cord. Here's T1 through T12, L1 and L2. All right, so the Thoracic and Lumbar division. These are the target organs in an autonomic response, a fight or flight response. So the eye is activated, salivary glands. Do you ever notice that you drool or don't drool when you're afraid of something? Heart rate, respiratory activation. All of these glands and targets are activated by T1 through T3. T1 sends out axons to each one of these individual chain ganglia. This is, and we call it an adrenergic, but acetylcholine synapse. This then branches to wherever it needs to go, and this is norepinephrine, telling the lung to breathe faster or do something differently. Now, when you come over here to T5, T6, 7, 8, and 9 all feed to what we call the celiac ganglia. The celiac ganglia then send other extensions out to the adrenal medulla, and actually what happens is T5 actually goes all the way, it doesn't even synapse here, it just goes all the way through the celiac ganglia and down to the adrenal medulla. Sorry, my little line kind of went crazy there. All right, so that's the nonstop route. On the other hand, you have the secondary, these post-ganglionic neurons. So the pre-ganglionic neurons are all in red. The post-ganglionic neurons are all in black. And again, the post-ganglionics here are going to be delivering information to targets like the liver, the stomach, the spleen, the pancreas. These are all norepinephrine. Right here, the pre-ganglionics, all acetylcholine. So hopefully what you're starting to see is that you have these short preganglionics extending out to long postganglionics, regulating activity out in the body. All right. Now, it ends usually with the lumbar at L2. We will be getting to L3, 4, and 5, and then the sacral region in a few minutes. All right. So anyways, the collateral chain ganglia are always paired. So you have 1 and 2, T1, T2, T2, T2. The collateral ganglia are not paired. You only have one. So there's only one celiac ganglion. There's only one superior mesenteric nerve over here that extends out. So each one of these ganglia, the inferior mesenteric ganglia, all of these are single ganglia. All right. This is a picture from your book. It's a little less detail, but it might be a little bit more clear for you to see what's going on. All right, so the sympathetic connections in the chain ganglia. Here's another example showing you they're suggesting in T1, this is in your book, the neuron sends an axon out to the chain ganglia, which then activates a secondary, or the postganglionic neuron here. And these little roots, these little curves are called rami. Okay, so this is the white ramus over here. Over here are the gray ramus. They come in. So right now, I don't want you to worry so much about a ramus. I do want you to pay attention to the ganglia adjacent to the chain ganglia adjacent to the spinal cord. All right. Sympathetic activation. Here's our preganglionic neuron coming into a ganglion, any ganglion, okay? It could be one of the chain ganglia. It could be one of the collateral ganglia, who knows? And here is the postganglionic neuron. So here's the pre and the post. The long fiber is coming through here and innervating just some smooth muscle somewhere. Who knows? Maybe in the stomach, right? What's interesting about these postganglionic neurons for the sympathetic nervous system is that these guys are going to start releasing, in this particular case, acetylcholine, okay? So all of these little bumps here are actually synapses, and each one of these bumps is called a varicosity, all right? So instead of being a cell like this, talking to another cell, and this being the synapse, and cell 1 talking to cell 2. This postganglionic neuron can send out long axons with these little bumps, and each one of these little bumps is going to regulate the activity of the smooth muscle by releasing norepinephrine. Okay, so the preganglionics are releasing acetylcholine, okay, onto the postganglionic, and the postganglionic is secreting norepinephrine onto the smooth muscle fibers. So what happens is, as the action potential arrives at each one of these varicosities, these little vesicles start dumping their norepinephrine on top of the smooth muscle, making the smooth muscle behave in a certain way. Don't worry about what that way is right now, okay? So we call acetylcholine cholinergic synapses, and they are always stimulatory. Acetylcholine always stimulates stuff. So when the preganglionic fiber dumps acetylcholine on the postganglionic, it's activating the postganglionic fiber. Postganglionic fiber releases norepinephrine, Okay, these are called adrenergic. So this is an adrenergic post-synaptic junction. And norepinephrine can be either stimulatory or it can be inhibitory. It can make things relax, all right? Depends on the tissues you're talking about. And so here's a picture from your book showing you how each one of these synaptic vesicles can release norepinephrine at the junction here, at the varicosity, and on the postsynaptic side, on the sarcolemma of that smooth muscle cell, each one of these little blue dots is a neurotransmitter receptor. Once the little green ball hits that receptor, it causes sodium to enter the cell, and it starts an action potential and makes the cell do what it needs to do. Isn't that cool? It's going to get more interesting in a few minutes when we start talking about parasympathetic activation. This is your craniosacral activation. Now remember, we talked about these short postganglionics, long postganglionics. Short pre, long post, right? Acetylcholine, then norepinephrine. Well, it's a little crazier in the parasympathetic rest digest system. So you have the cranial nerves 3, 7, 9, and 10. The vagus nerve, oh my gosh, I'll have to tell you about that in a minute. The vagus nerve, I'll start with 3, 7, and 9. Each one of these nerves control, again, the eye, salivary gland, and the salivary gland. So here's this isn't from the cervical region here. This is from the brainstem, from the pons and the brainstem. We have, let's say, the ciliary ganglion and the submandibular ganglion. What's happening here is you have long pre-ganglionic, so long pre's, and short postganglionics. And you can see that here. These neurons start in the brainstem, in the pons and in the brainstem, and they extend all the way out to the ciliary ganglion, submandibular ganglion, and so forth, to cause a separate response here. Here's what's interesting. You have acetylcholine at this junction. Actually, I'm wrong. That's norepinephrine at that junction. This is norepinephrine, and this is norepinephrine. Acetylcholine is only in the sympathetic. So we have cranial nerves 3, 7, 9, and 10. 10, the vagus nerve, you might as well just dedicate that to your memory. The vagus nerve is a huge nerve that brings information into the brainstem. Actually, it activates processes after information comes in. Let's put it that way. And it can do all kinds of really crazy fun, maybe sometimes not fun things. So one of the things that the vagus nerve does is it causes a change in blood pressure as a consequence to activation. So let's say the vagus nerve gets a trigger to do something, a really strong activation. Usually the vagus nerve is activated after a very, very painful stimulation. So an example that I can use because this was me. I was at a doctor's office and I turned around and I hit my elbow really, really hard on a sharp corner, really hard. And one of the things about me, I mean, you haven't really seen me very much. I'm little, but for some reason, my elbows and my knees are super sensitive. I don't know what it is. But if I hit during a patellar reflex, I'll pass out if it's hard enough. My elbow's the same way. So I hit my elbow, and it was at the eye doctor's office. And I was sitting there, and the doctor was looking into my pupil, and he said, "Are you okay?" And I was feeling very dizzy and very nauseous, and I almost passed out. And what it was I had a vagal activation because I had an extremely strong nociceptor activation. Now, you don't see that here. You're looking at the viscera. A similar process happens during childbirth. So let's say, for example, the uterus starts contracting, and childbirth it doesn't feel great. Okay, I have two. I'll just tell you now, it doesn't feel great. But one of the things that happens is vagal activation does help the uterus contract to help the baby be born. All right. And so uterine contractions are very painful, especially strong uterine contractions. And that causes a change in blood pressure and all sorts of things. And what does that make mom do? Lay down, chill out, not run away. during the birthing process. So in this particular case, you're going to see a very, very long preganglionic axon coming all the way down and an extremely short postganglionic axon right on the uterus. So the preganglionics long, postganglionics short, which is exactly opposite of the sympathetic division. Preganglionics short in sympathetic, very, very long in the postganglionic. This is a picture in your book that'll help outline the same process. And again, we call this craniosacral. So craniosacral activation, parasympathetic, pre and postganglionics all use acetylcholine. I said norepinephrine. I am losing my mind. I did say norepinephrine. I was right the first time. Acetylcholine. All acetylcholine. Oh my gosh. You know what? I guess you can call the dean and just tell Dr. Val didn't know what she was talking about. I'm sorry. I have a love affair with norepinephrine because it's the underappreciated neurotransmitter, but that's a separate story. Acetylcholine is important because there are different types of receptors that are activated as a consequence of acetylcholine release at the postganglionic junction, pre to postganglionic junction. There are things called nicotinic receptors. They're called nicotinic because they'll also be activated by nicotine, right? And this always stimulates ganglionic cells. And then we have these other things called muscarinic receptors. Muscarinic receptors are called muscarinic receptors after muscarine mushrooms. And these are really long-lasting effects. These acetylcholine receptors can either be excitatory or inhibitory if they're muscarinic. So it's like ice cream. Receptors are like ice cream. You have different flavors of ice cream. You have different flavors of receptors that interact with and receive signals from acetylcholine. Acetylcholine itself is really rapidly degraded in all synaptic clefts in all tissues of the body through an enzyme called acetylcholine esterase. Acetylcholine esterase, whenever it runs into acetylcholine, just breaks it down. And the reason being is that wherever acetylcholine is used, whether or not it's excitatory or inhibitory, and usually acetylcholine is excitatory. Almost everywhere it's excitatory. There are few inhibitory effects, but mostly it's excitatory. You want to turn off that activation very quickly. You don't want it to remain on. So snake venom is an example of a compound that actually inactivates acetylcholine esterase. If acetylcholine esterase is inactivated, then a muscle will contract because acetylcholine tells it to, but it'll never relax because acetylcholine sits there constantly activating. So acetylcholine esterase gets rid of acetylcholine in the synaptic cleft of both, well, all three, smooth, skeletal, and cardiac muscle. All right, that was probably our fastest lecture yet. And please come back here and review. This was my fault, my bad. See, teachers make mistakes too. These are all acetylcholine. I am sorry that I said that was norepinephrine. It's all acetylcholine. Have a great day.